Hello everyone, my name is Eli Andy. I'm a GRE trainer here at the Kenya Airlift program. Today we'll be looking at the structure or the organization of reading comprehension questions, which we find in the verbal reasoning section of the GRE. Welcome and let's begin. Now, the reading comprehension questions basically requires you to read some passage and answer questions based on that passage. The verbal section of the GRE has two sections, and the first section has fewer questions than the second section. So you should expect about five reading comprehension questions in the first section, and these 5 questions will be spread over about 2 to 3 passages. In the second section, expect about 8 reading comprehension questions spread over 4 passages. Now, the passages vary in length. Some can be as short as 1 paragraph, but many of them will be several paragraphs in length. The GRE test takers draw these passages from different domains or different industries, and they also get them from different places or publications. So there are passages drawn from books, magazines, biographies, textbook, etc. Now they are drawn from different domains like the social sciences, natural science, humanities, arts, and politics. The good news is that the GRE verbal section actually does not test the domain knowledge of these passages. You are not required to have specific knowledge in natural science, for example, if you come across a passage talking about natural science. What the GRE test is your ability to evaluate, synthesize, and draw conclusions on specific passages. So you really don't need the domain knowledge. But you should get acquainted with this kind of passages before you are tested it, because they can be quite complex and dense. So in order to get your mind in the right frame of comprehending the reading comprehension questions you are likely to meet in the GRE, you should start practicing by reading posts from different publications like the Washington Post. Another publication you can read is the Nature Journal. Yeah, we also have the New Yorker, and different college textbooks, especially postgraduate college textbooks. They will expose you to the kind of writing you are likely to face in the GRE reading comprehension questions. Now, let's have a look at the main type of questions the GRE test takers like to include. The first, we have the traditional multiple choice questions where you are given a passage, you read, and you choose one answer based on that passage. So this is rather straightforward for most test takers. You are only required to choose one answer among the multiple answer choices. The second type of question to expect is multiple choice questions where you are required to choose between one or more answer choices. One or more. This type of question usually have 3 answer choices. And the answer can be one of these 3, 2 of these 3, or even all of them. And you should note that you have to get all the answer choices correct to get full marks for this type of questions. You don't get half a point or partial marks for getting half the answer right. So for example, if the answer choices are all the 3 are right, and you only get to take one of them, you get 0 marks for that point. Then we also have the selecting passage type of question, where you are basically required to read the question and use the mouse or keyboard. Mouse or keyboard to choose your answer choice. in the passage. So most tech takers actually find it easy to use the mouse to click the sentence in the passage that answers the question. Now let's have a look at the organization of GRE passages. These passages, as you'd expect, are organized in different ways, but here we look at the major three organization structures to expect. So we have three basic organization of reading comprehension questions to expect. The first, we have passages that introduce a problem and then provide the solution to that problem. So you usually find the problem in the beginning of the passage, maybe even in the first paragraph, and then later on in the after explaining the problem or discussing it, you find the conclusion towards the end of the passage. So problem, then solution. Now we also have the second structure here where the passage asks a question and then later on answers it. So the author asks a question, usually in the beginning of the passage, and then later on in the passage provides an answer. Then we have the third type, where the passage basically describes or discusses an old hypothesis and criticizes it. Then the passage concludes by introducing a new hypothesis that is supposedly better and should replace the old one. Now, most of the passages are designed to have certain building blocks. And that is why we say today we'll be looking at the structure of these passages. They have building blocks, and knowing these building blocks will help you to answer these questions better. So we basically have 4 building blocks that are easy to recognize. We have the point, background, support, and implications. And we'll look at them one by one. Let's look at the point first. Now, the point is usually the most important information that the author wants you to get from the passage. Yeah, it is the main point actually of the passage, why the passage was written in the first place. That is the point. It's what the passage is talking about. Next, we have the background. The background usually provides the contextual information that you need to understand the point. The background tends to be a little bit tricky for some test takers to recognize because in most cases, it forms the bulk of the passage. It can contain many twisting statements, heady paragraphs, tense sentences, idioms, and things like that. But with enough practice, you'll get better at it, and you'll be able to recognize the background information even in the first reading of the passage. Then we also have support building block, the third one. Now, the support building block gives you additional information that you need to understand the passage. So you find that in most cases, the support is given as evidence or examples of the author's main point. So when you come across evidences in an argument or examples, you should know that you are dealing with the support building blocks. Then lastly, we have the implication. Now the implication is basically the effect or the result or the consequences or implications of the author's main point. So the implication basically ties up the passage neatly and concludes it. It's almost like a conclusion of the passage. Yeah. Now, why should we bother to know about this organizational structure of reading comprehension, or to go about understanding the building blocks? For one, understanding the structure of RC questions will help you in the test, because there's some questions that directly ask you about the organization of the passage or the structure. Secondly, understanding these building blocks will also help you to understand other related questions, because you will get to know to understand the passage without reading it multiple times.
You're watching Success with Bob Mwiti Show, presented to you by Upstake America. Upstake America is a consulting company that helps immigrants find amazing higher education and job opportunities in the tech industry in the United States. You can find our programs by going to www.upstakeamerica.com. Upstake America, we wake you up to the unlimited potential.
Now, let's look at some of the ways in which the GRE introduces its questions. Let's look at the main idea questions first. Now, this is one of the most frequent questions you'll find in the reading comprehension section of the GRE. And mastering it means you are halfway to passing. You're more than halfway, actually, to passing your reading comprehension question. So the main idea questions, like we discussed, ask you to identify the main point or the primary purpose of the passage. So these questions are introduced in these ways. You can find a question asking, in this passage, the author is primarily concerned with, or the author's primary purpose in the passage is. You can also find a main idea question asking, the passage is mainly concerned with, or the best title of the passage is. Yes. So when you find questions dealing with the purpose, main point, main idea, title, these all are asking you to identify the main idea in the passage. Let's have a look at the second question. That is the turn of author questions, which many test takers find tricky. These questions basically ask you to identify the author's emotion or attitude towards the argument. Yeah. So you need to read the passage, analyze it, and identify the tone of the author. For example, is the author contemplative? What is their attitude towards the argument? Yeah. Are they polite? Is the author optimistic? Is the author angry? Is the author positive? This kind of word should trigger you to understand that you are dealing with the tone of author question. Then we have specific fact questions, which are usually rather straightforward because they basically ask you to identify or spot specific information in the passage. So you might, examples of these questions read, the author refers to example phrase in line 5 primarily in order to. Yeah. So when you find a question reading like, according to paragraph 5, the main reason for doing this is, or the author cites experimental errors in order to, or the author uses then this line so that in order to. These kind of questions are called specific fact questions. Then we have implied or inference questions. Now, implied or inference questions is one of the two types of questions in reading comprehensions that requires you to go outside the passage to get the correct answer choice. In all the other questions, you are restricted to using the passage or ideas in the passage exclusively. But in implied questions, and another question we'll have a look at later in the session, requires you to draw from ideas that are not expressly mentioned in the passage. So in implied questions, you need to read the passage, understand it, so that from among the answer choices, you can get one that you can infer from the passage, or that an understanding reader can conclude the author would agree with. For example, you can get an implied question asking, which of the following would the author be most likely to agree with? Or which position does the author find most appealing? Or which position does the author find most objectionable? Yeah. So inference or implications requires you to predict, based on the organization and the text of the passage, to predict an answer choice that the author would, that someone would reasonably draw from reading the passage. Then we also have structural questions. Now, as the name suggests, structural questions basically ask you to understand the passage and choose an answer choice that agrees with its structure. So here you are looking at the organization of specific paragraph or the organization of the whole passage you have just read. So here you'll find a question like, which of the following best describes the structure of the passage? Or what is the organization of this paragraph? Or how would you term the organization of the passage from line 10 to line 15? These are structure questions. Then we also have extrapolation questions. Now, I mentioned earlier when talking about the implied questions that implied questions or inference questions are one of the two questions that requires you to use ideas outside the passage to answer your questions. Now, extrapolation questions is another example. This is the second one of that type of questions. So in this case also, you are required to use information that is not expressly mentioned in the passage to answer your question. Most test takers, again, find these questions a bit tricky because they are not direct and they require you to use ideas that are not expressly mentioned. But again, like with all other question types, once you practice and get to know how RC questions are organized, you'll get better at extrapolation questions too. In most cases for extrapolation questions, you'll be required to read the passage and get among the answer choices a sentence that best describes or is similar or mimics the author's position or the specific paragraphs you are being asked about. Basically, you will be asked to draw an analogy between the answer choice and what is in the passage. So again, you have to go beyond the passage to get the extrapolation question right. Now, we have exception questions that ask you to identify an idea that is not in the passage, or an idea that the author would not agree with. So that is why sometimes they are referred to as negative questions, something the passage would not agree with. So exception questions examples include The passage states all of the following about mitochondria, except, so when you notice this, you should know that you're dealing with an exception question. Yeah? Other terms may be apart from, or other than. So you may be asked, all of the following are right according to the passage other than, or the following questions explain the author's argument except. So these are exception or negative exception questions that requires you to understand the passage so that you can get an answer that the passage would not agree with. Lastly, let's have a look at contextual questions. From the word context, you can understand that contextual questions requires you to understand the meaning of something, but within its context in the passage. So in this case, you may be asked to give the meaning of a word, a phrase, or even an idiom. But remember, you should not give the ordinary meaning of this word or its meaning as used in everyday life. Rather, you should go back to the passage and consider how it is used so that you can get its meaning as used in the passage. So examples of conceptual questions, they usually begin as used in the passage. This term means, pause, or as used in paragraph 5. This phrase means, or this term as used in the passage refers to. So here you'll have meaning, means, or meaning. We can also have refers to. And if you read the passage and understand it correctly, you should be able to use the answer choices to get the meaning of that word or phrase or idiom, even if it is something you are reading for the first time in the text. Now, that is all for today. Thank you for listening and watching. I hope you've learned something. Let's meet again next time to discuss specific examples of this type of questions. Goodbye.